Good evening. Welcome to the 8th and final program of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan 2022 Great Decision Series, with topics suggested by the Foreign Policy Association. I am Ping Liang, Managing Director of AlphaMax Advisors, and a board member of the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan. On behalf of the staff and the entire board, I thank you for your attendance, both here and also online. We are pleased to host a Great Decision Series on Grand Rapids Community College's campus. We are grateful to the college's president, Bill Pink, provost Brian Caneto, video producer Claes Quant, and campus colleagues for their support and expertise. We cannot do it without you. It is the council's mission to empower the people and organizations of West Michigan to engage thoughtfully with the world. We do this through the support of nearly 50 local companies, 11 colleges, universities, and many community members like yourself. Together, we seek to provide programming that is credible, objective, relevant, civil, and connecting. To change the world, we believe, one must first know the world. And you can learn more about our council on our website, worldmichigan.org. Before we begin tonight's program, we want to give thanks to Wolverine Worldwide as our Great Decision Series sponsor, Blue Lake Public Radio and the Community Media Center as media sponsors, and to the Friends of the Great Decision Program as tonight's topic sponsor. Tonight, we are so honored to host Elizabeth Shackelford, a senior fellow at the Chicago Council on Foreign Affairs. Thank you, Elizabeth, for taking the time to be here with us in person in West Michigan. After tonight's moderated program, there will be ample time for questions, as you all know. And for those here in person, we will have a microphone to pass around. For those watching online, you can send in your questions through the chat box, and we will get it here. Please, when you ask questions, exhibit civility to our guest and hospitality to other audience by asking respectful and succinct questions. So now, Dr. Joe Westra of the Politics and Economics Department at Calvin University will introduce the presenter. Dr. Westra.
Thank you, Ping. And thanks you to the World Affairs Council of Western Michigan for this partnership and this opportunity to dialogue on U.S. foreign policy at such a significant global moment. Our guest tonight, Elizabeth Shackelford, joined the Chicago Council on Global Affairs in January 2021 as a senior fellow on U.S. foreign policy. Her analysis, writing, and outreach focus on building awareness and understanding of a restraint approach to foreign policy, which seeks to limit the use of military force to the defense of core U.S. national security interests and favors robust diplomatic engagement. Shackelford was a career diplomat with the U.S. Department of State until December 2017. She is the author of the Dissent Channel, American Diplomacy in a Dishonest Age, which was the winner of the 2020 Douglas Dillon Book Award. As a Foreign Service officer, Shackelford served in Somalia, Kenya, South Sudan, Poland, and Washington, D.C., tracking political and conflict developments, advising mission and Washington leadership, and advocating for U.S. interests with foreign counterparts. For her work in South Sudan, During the outbreak of the Civil War in 2013, Shackelford received the Barbara Watson Award for Consular Excellence, the highest honor for consular work. As a non-resident fellow with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft in 2020, Shackelford conducted research, analysis, and commentary on the costs of a militarized approach to foreign policy. Prior to joining the State Department, Shackelford was an associate with Booz Allen Hamilton, where she had led USAID projects to assess business environments in developing countries. She was also an associate in the law firm Covington & Burling, where she focused on international trade law. Shackelford's op-eds and commentary have been published in numerous outlets. She has a BA from Duke University and a JD from the University of Pittsburgh. Born and raised in Mississippi, Shackelford now resides in Rochester, Vermont. Our discussion tonight is entitled Biden's Foreign Policy, Where It Started and Where It's Going. Let's welcome Elizabeth Shackelford.
Thank you.
So we'd had some time to converse briefly by email, and as you know, in preparation for this conversation, I was reviewing your book, The Dissent Channel, in which you recollect a part of your career at the State Department. And it contains this interesting discussion of the role of diplomats in U.S. foreign policy and of some of the harmful trends that you observed during your career. So I'd like to start out by asking about some of the things you note in your book, and then we'll extend the conversation more generally. So the title of your book, of course, references the State Department's Dissent Channel. Can you tell us a bit more about what the channel is, how it functions, and what role you think it does play, or at least should play, in U.S. foreign policy?
Sure. Well, the Dissent Channel. I want to make sure we can. Okay, that's better. The Dissent Channel is this kind of, it's almost like a hallowed tool of communication in the halls of the State Department and the federal government. It's an official channel of communication, which typically comes through as what they call a cable, which is the way that you do official communication from the field, from our embassies overseas back to Washington. And it was established in the kind of Vietnam War era, because that was, unsurprisingly, a time when you had a lot of dissent within the ranks of the career foreign service. And so it was designed, the way that they, that it was kind of described and is still described today is this way for career diplomats and anyone working in the State Department to be able to raise official policy concerns in a way that ensures that they make it all the way up to the 7th floor, which is where the Secretary of State's office is. So the idea is it's meant to be a way to promote really robust debate around foreign policy within the department. In practice, and in my personal view, this was probably what it was intended to be at the time it was created during the Nixon administration. It really kind of acts as a way to release the pressure. It's almost like a pressure valve. Because the idea is when you've exhausted all of other efforts from the inside, trying to change things from the inside, then there's this last resort item you can do, and you can file an official dissent. The issue is, it doesn't actually work to promote debate because there's no way to search for them. It doesn't open any lines of communication. It basically goes up to the Secretary's office where someone kindly is required under the regulations to send you a response within 90 days. So they are forced to read it and pay attention. But I can't say that there's ever been an opportunity that I'm aware of where a major foreign policy decision is changed based on something filed through this channel.
So you've given us some historic context and a little bit about the process. One of the things you note in your book is that part of the motivation was by concern with the White House, in your words, shaping foreign policy decisions to influence narrow political goals and domestic policy ends. And I picked up on that line because that's something I end up talking about a lot in my courses, I encounter in my own research. Can you talk a little bit about that tension or set of tensions that exists between foreign and domestic policy goals and the role of politics and public opinion in the making of foreign policy?
Unfortunately, it's just inevitable in a democracy that you're going to be working on a limited timeline, right? And ours is 4 years if you're generous, 2 years if you're realistic, that you have to do things that might end up getting kind of not the immediate results that you want. The problem is foreign policy issues are, I mean, they're generational. It takes a long time to really change the course of, a country's path or our relationship with another country. These things don't change overnight. But politically, I mean, it's not so cynical as to say that foreign policy decisions are made in order to get votes. I mean, frankly, nobody really votes on foreign policy anyway. But in my experience, particularly, it's mostly about we're trying to keep bad things out of the news. So this focus on the short-term security interests, short-term priorities. And I think back to when I was in Somalia. And a very specific instance for me was I arrived in Somalia in 2016. Interesting year to arrive there. But we actually had our first ambassador there since the Black Hawk Down incident of the 1990s. So it was this remarkable time when we were looking forward to a real shift in our relationship with the country. We were going to reopen our embassy. We had our first ambassador. Somalia had become a pretty important counterterrorism partner of ours. And when I first signed up for this position, I was told, yeah, right now diplomats are stuck on the airport compound and they can't really go anywhere. But that's going to change. We're getting an ambassador. We're getting a real mission. They're going to get the security we need and the permissions that we need for you to go out there and actually do diplomacy. And kind of 1 month passes and 2 months pass, and they're like, yeah, we're still working out the permissions with the White House. And then finally in the early fall, the message comes down, the White House just wants us to get past these elections and then it's all going to change. I don't have to finish that story. People know what did change. And at that point, that whole path that we'd had over a couple of years of them trying to get us to this point where we had a different relationship, because that was a priority of that administration. It wasn't a priority of the next administration, but the administration that was in power at the time didn't want to risk, a Benghazi incident, some big security incident, and have diplomats kidnapped or blown up all over the news right before an election. I mean, I'm glad that they were concerned about our security, but I'm not sure that was really the priority. So that's the kind of short-term thinking, though, that can really prevent us from following through with the investments in a change in our foreign policy.
It's a different way than we might be tempted to think about foreign policy decision-making as short-term damage control rather than long-term strategic. Mm-hmm. You'd noted, and I agree with you, that foreign policy issues typically aren't election issues, but what was interesting about both 2016 and 2020 was they became more election issues than they typically are, with 2016 having its own version of should there be continuity or change, and 2020 largely about trying to reverse course and go back to something different, something more normal. The Biden administration has used the phrase often a foreign policy for the middle class, a sort of campaign slogan of foreign policy, really quite extraordinary. And he's presented this, this gets back to the context of 2016, as a needed correction to what had happened then, but also to a more general set of trends post-Cold War about U.S. foreign policy, the establishment, and the general trends of ignoring concerns of the American middle class and instead pursuing relentless globalization. I was wondering if you could discuss that trend and some of the other broad trends and put the Biden administration in context a little bit. How much do you think that the Biden administration's focus, or at least proclaimed focus on the middle class, will be a sort of necessary correction to some of the more extreme or unhelpful aspects of that trend, or how much it might actually be shaped to these narrow domestic policy goals at the expense of U.S. foreign policy overall?
Well, it's a really fascinating development for foreign policy, and I think it's a lot bigger than what people tend to think. There's a lot more behind it. I mean, it is a campaign slogan, it's a catchy phrase, and it is meant to appeal to the American people. But there's also this very big backstory behind it as well. And so if you ask different people in the administration what a foreign policy for the middle class means, which, by the way, I do frequently, you will always get different answers because there are kind of different veins even within the administration that are trying to work out exactly what it is. I have a lot of appreciation for the sentiment behind it because it comes from this long-standing idea that is very true. We've seen throughout history that foreign policy is really kind of an elite sport. Americans don't tend to vote on it, and there's this sense that what is best for America is best for Americans, And the folks in Washington, D.C. who do this professionally know best what that is. So don't worry your pretty little head about it. We'll sort it out for you. And you focus on the domestic issues that matter most to you. One of the things that we've realized in this globalized world is that foreign policy matters really do affect domestic issues at home. So there is that issue. There's the issue that in our globalized world, they are intricately related, domestic and foreign policy. And you've heard this over and over again from the campaign period and into the early period of this administration. They're talking about how we're not going to have a hard line between the two, which makes a lot of sense. But in terms of what that really means in practice is a different story. And I think it's interesting to note that this tagline, this phrase, actually came out of a report from the that was by a think tank, the Carnegie, why am I blanking on their term, Institute, that had a number of members of the Obama administration who came in after the last administration and spent several years working on a big report, Foreign Policy for the Middle Class. And what they decided, they were basically wrestling with, well, what did we get wrong? Which I think is really refreshing. And they put this big report out that said, America's foreign policy has rarely looked at what the impact of that foreign policy is on average American people. Really interesting backstory to this is that, and you can tell as you read the report, which I have done, I'm not sure how many people actually do, there was a lot of disagreement within the co-authors of this report. And you can just see from one paragraph to the next as they're wrestling with what exactly it means. So they really did dive into these issues, but they did not come out on the same end game of, so what should we do and how could you build a foreign policy that serves the American people? Now, fast forward to the administration, and a number of these authors are now in high-level positions in Biden's foreign policy team. And they're continuing to wrestle with it. So I think that there's a genuine interest in finding a way to ensure that our foreign policy serves the American people's interests. I think there's also a genuine disagreement on the inside of how exactly to do that. And you mentioned the issue, the economic issue, and how our globalized economy has really impacted Americans here. And I think that there's a big difference of opinion that's being worked out over, how much do we, onshore essential supply chains that we need for national security issues? How much do we allow ourselves to be reliant on governments and trade with countries that we don't share our values with? And I think had there been fewer big crises this year, they probably would have taken more time to sort it out. But instead, what we've seen is a lot of rhetoric talking about how do we bring jobs home, bring manufacturing home. A lot of that is probably not particularly realistic in terms of some of the things that they like to do. But at the same time, particularly both through the initiative here was the COVID. It was how COVID had impacted a lot of our global supply chains and then the rise of China as well. But lo and behold, we're looking at a crisis right now in Ukraine and utilizing our economic tools to put pressure in this situation. And we have a lot more kind of weak points than we might have thought of before, and certainly some of our allies do as well. So I do think, though, that we're seeing more of a tie, and that Americans can see more of a tie between national security and our economy. So my long answer to that, kind of whittled down, is that I think they're still working it out, but right now the high-level ideas that the folks coming into the administration had and what they wanted to do to kind of rework our foreign policy probably would have been more of a very kind of delicate balance to find ways to work with trusted allies on critical supply chains, find ways to build the resilience of our own economies at home, and find a way to balance that still with having the benefits of trade with countries like China, but without having a dependence that makes us really vulnerable. What have we gotten instead so far is we've seen the Biden administration unwilling to roll back a lot of the very protectionist trade regulations and issues that the Trump administration had put in place. The tariffs, many of them are still in place, not only against China, which I think that there's a very strong argument to be made to keep some of those tariffs on China based on various acts. But still, it was only last week, I think, that some of our tariffs with Canada were rolled back. And, only a few months ago with the UK. Like, this is where I think there's been that domestic influence it wouldn't have been popular at times where China's still kind of the boogeyman for us to roll back some of those tariffs, even if the Biden administration might have thought that didn't make sense. And similarly, is it not popular with a domestic audience to roll back tariffs on things when you've got a really difficult trading environment now anyway? So I think that's another example of where domestic concerns are pushing in a way that might be short-term beneficial politically, but not necessarily long-term. So I think they're still working out what it means, but my hope is that every day, and I think we're seeing this with Ukraine, that those who are leading our foreign policy keep that line in the back of their head of how will this foreign policy decision affect Americans, not just because of the upcoming election, but because of what they're going to need to make themselves secure and prosperous in the future. So that sentiment is a strong one. How it's been worked out, not terribly robustly yet, but I guess it's a wait and see spot.
I think you're right. And related to this tension between domestic politics and foreign policy decision making, I think when we start to go back to this idea of foreign policy for the middle class, and then we juxtapose that with something else the Biden administration has emphasized, and that is returning to or restoring or strengthening a rules-based international order, we come to another sort of tension that you've alluded to a bit as well. President Trump had similarly suggested that he was going to pay more attention to, he usually didn't refer to it as the middle class, but those who were poorly treated by policy trends. But he was quite explicit that the price of doing so would be withdrawing from or not complying with international institutions, that they were not helping Americans, and therefore he was willing to break them as appropriate to serve those Americans. So the Biden administration has tried to come and bring that together, but of course that's difficult. How successful do you think the Biden administration can be once things settle in Ukraine a bit and it has a little more attention to focus to these issues? How successful do you think the Biden administration can be in addressing that tension between foreign policy for the middle class and a rules-based international order? Or do you think his policy inevitably will have to have some of the same transactional quality that the Trump administration's foreign policy is often criticized for?
Well, I think it's almost impossible to get entirely away from transactional foreign policy, but I do think that this administration is less susceptible to it on a number of fronts. I'll caveat that by saying if you look at things like some of the meetings in just recent days between Secretary of State Tony Blinken and heading to the Middle East to talk with allies there, you're seeing some of that transactional nature in process. I mean, we've had a bit of a back and forth with Saudi Arabia, and that's certainly, that's a country that hasn't been a particularly strong democratic ally. We have issues there, and those are definitely transactional, and that's about a very short-term issue, which is oil, which is what's going on with oil, because that affects us domestically. So not at all insulated from it. But at the same time, I think that the Biden administration had a much more open door to push on when it came to working with our allies and really reinvigorating those institutions and those relationships. And I say that in part, I actually think some of the issues that the Biden administration thought they were coming up against, that they thought that Donald Trump had uncovered something somehow, I actually think haven't been proven out in fact. And we saw this with the Chicago Council has an annual survey. They've actually been doing it since the 1970s, so they've got a lot of back data to cover it. And our survey last year asked a lot of very pointed questions about partnerships and allies, and there's widespread support for working with our allies. I mean, the American people aren't isolationists. They're particular about, if you ask them an up and down question about, democracy abroad or economy at home, yeah, they're going to say economy at home. But when you ask them about, issues of allies and supporting our allies and coming to their defense, they're very enthusiastic, broadly speaking. They're also very enthusiastic about international trade, which is another one of those areas that I think the Biden administration might have gotten wrong with, their expectations that Americans want to be protectionist and bring everything home. So a bit of it might be underestimating where the American people are in global engagement. And part of that might have been a bit of a backlash on the Trump years of pulling back from all of these. My big hope, though, I feel that the Biden administration has put a tremendous amount of time and effort into explaining to the American people why these relationships matter, why they're spending a lot of time with different partners. And the Ukraine crisis, one of the things it has demonstrated is how valuable that slow time of working with your allies is. Because, I mean, the most notable thing that we've done to date is to rally, all of our NATO partners behind some very serious economic measures that have had, some of the biggest impact on Putin. And, it hasn't ended the war, but at this stage, I mean, ending the war is up to Putin. That's not in the control of the United States. But it still has shown our ability to, when we work together as opposed to on our own, and when we invest the time in getting everyone on the same page, how powerful it can be. So I think that Americans are, they are ready to be very supportive on that front. And, my hope is that, we get a little bit more credit for the kind of slow roll of the efforts that you have to take at these non-military tools, such that we can buy some time for, for the administration to be able to take some of those longer-term investments rather than having to make the short-term decisions. But the election cycle will always come, so we'll never be immune from that.
It certainly will. I agree with you, though, that the crisis in Ukraine certainly has increased in appreciation of the American public regarding the interconnection between security policy, economic policy, and really the domestic consequences of both of those things. So it will be interesting to see how that plays out with the election and beyond. You've done a very good job of talking through some of these constraints and challenges that face any administration in general in its foreign policy. The Biden administration specifically has been our focus here. I wanted to ask you, what role do you see for the professional diplomatic corps in helping to address some of those tensions, find a way through, and really help to shape effective U.S. foreign policy?
This is an issue that's near and dear to my heart because, as you watch what impact we can have when you have the White House and the National Security Council pour so many resources into trying to address this major crisis in Europe. It's a reminder that we could do a lot more than we do with our diplomatic efforts, but one of those challenges is that we have really politicized a lot of our foreign policy levers. Not kind of on a partisan level, but just in fact, in the sheer fact that we have so many political appointments that come with each new administration. So every change in administration, you're going to have hundreds, if not thousands, of vacancies just on the State Department side alone that have to be filled very rapidly. And even if you don't have Congress throwing wrenches and trying to stop confirmation hearings, even under the best of circumstances, you have a new administration that's trying to do absolutely everything from scratch. The State Department has twice as many political appointments as the Department of Defense. It has 10 times more than nearly any other agency, and that just means it's that much less continuity with every change. You've also seen over time the National Security Council, which is kind of meant to be the coordinating body for basically for everything inside the White House, to bring different agencies together and coordinate them so that the White House can bring all the different parts of the federal government together. On foreign policy, the National Security Council has really kind of become its own mini State Department. Started out in the 60s with like a staff of 10. It has 400 or so staff now. They have a large Africa team, a large Europe team. They have teams that cover all sorts of different different categories within foreign policy that we do, substantive issues as well. And the National Security Council drives what we're doing. And on every kind of interagency meeting that deals with foreign affairs, State Department has a seat, but it only has one. Department of Defense has two, because they have their civilian and their military representatives. So you're literally outnumbered. And so it's led to this situation where you're running our foreign policy from inside the White House in a place that cannot but be politically driven. Again, not out of partisan issues, but strictly out of the different timelines that you have from, say, a career diplomat who's working in a region over the course of a very long time and has that longer term perspective and horizon to work with. And I just think that if we would resource the State Department better, professionalize our foreign policy better, and rely more on those who stay throughout, nonpartisan from one administration to the next, then we might be able to put that same, not the same level of focus that we're putting on Ukraine, but an appropriate amount of focus on utilizing those tools, leading with diplomacy. And we would have a better ability to kind of really see through longer term foreign policy goals. And instead of, at this time, and you just see it based on resources alone, I mean, the Department of Defense runs a lot of our foreign policy because they just outnumber out-resource diplomats at every turn. I could go into a long story about Somalia and how we couldn't even get rides across the country because we didn't have planes, but they had plenty of planes. They could go anywhere they wanted.
Let's talk a little bit more about the role of diplomats. One of the interesting things you note in your book, as you were talking about your time in Juba, South Sudan, was a different sort of tension, not really a political tension, but almost a personal tension between advocacy and diplomacy facing diplomats in the field. Can you talk a little bit more about what that tension looks like, how you attempted to navigate it when you were in the Foreign Service, and what role that might play in helping or hindering effective U.S. foreign policy?
So diplomacy is a funny thing because there are times when you are meant to be an advocate. You're meant to be advocating certain positions. You're meant to be pushing a government or your counterparts in a government to take certain actions. But much of the time, as a career diplomat, as the diplomat representing in the field, you're not the policy maker, you're the policy implementer. So you are influencing what the U.S. government decides to do, but you're certainly not driving it. Everything on kind of the policy making is really driven in Washington by things and factors that you can't really see. So when I was in South Sudan, for example, I was, what would be best for us to do in South Sudan wasn't necessarily best for the U.S. to do in the entire region because everything's intricately linked and we had relationships with the other countries. And if we could utilize our pressure on other countries to improve what they were doing in South Sudan, for example, that, to me, would have made a lot of sense. But then you go back to Washington and they're like, well, we can't press President Museveni in Uganda to take his military out of South Sudan because then what is he going to do with our counterterrorism mission in Somalia that he's working on, which we prioritize much higher than South Sudan. So these things are all very intricately linked. But my hope in South Sudan, sometimes it's almost like being a lawyer advocating for a client, right? Like I'm advocating for what is best for us to do in South Sudan back to Washington. Washington is making decisions based on that much bigger picture. Sometimes I will allow that sometimes they see bigger picture issues, that if you're one political officer on the ground on a country at war, you are not going to have, be as attuned to. But other times I think that they get blinded by, again, the short-term political interest. Well, if we can just keep this war quiet enough until we get through the elections, then we can do something about it. And I saw that a lot too. So, the question was, I might be an internal advocate, pressing for us to do something different on South Sudan, which I frequently was most of the time. But then you have to turn around and represent what the U.S. government is saying our policy is. And that does become very tricky. And that's been tricky for diplomats, for all of time. And it always will be, because you'll never agree with everything that comes down from the White House. But you have to decide for yourself, which of those fights are worth continuing to fight, which of those fights you can accept, and then when things are done that you can't represent. And I actually did this within the parameters of the State Department. I had a few things where it went too far for me, well before I resigned. We had moments where I said, I'm not going to write that report because I disagree with it. Of course, I thought people would be like, oh, well, if our junior officer there isn't going to write the report, surely we must be doing something terrible. We must reconsider what we're doing. And it's like somebody else just added their name and sent it off, and it was fine, and nobody cared. But I didn't, but I drew my line at certain things. And it's what you lose by leaving something like the State Department is that opportunity to work your way up and find ways within the system to hopefully find ways to change it. And everybody on the inside has to balance when that's good enough.
We've talked a fair bit about the short term, about the narrow domestically political. Another interesting theme I found in your book was another sort of overly narrowness. You talk about even when we have the policymaking apparatus considering a broad national interest, they define it actually quite narrowly. And you believe that that should be expanded a little bit, and in your words, taking a stand for values of human rights and justice, when doing so can make a difference, an important caveat. And as you were exploring that theme, I was struck by the classic claim made in the 1940s by Hans Morgenthau, the international relations scholar, who said really the opposite, that that's how you get in trouble, that you need to think about national interest quite narrowly and stay away from these abstract moral principles. So can you talk about the tension there, the opportunity there, and maybe a little bit specifically about how you see overly narrow interpretations of U.S. national interest leading to bad foreign policy.
I actually think that, particularly the realists of the world, the international relations realists, are seeing some of those theories that have stood for a very long time kind of hit a bit of a wall with what we're looking at in Ukraine. Of course, the realists won't tell you that. But I think that it's what we're seeing demonstrated in Ukraine is that when you continue to prioritize your kind of short-term security and stability imperatives, and I think stability is really the word that gets us, right? It's like it's stable. Well, it's stable for how long and what keeps it stable. But oftentimes, when you are promoting something that's going to keep things from getting unstable and unpredictable in the short term, you are inadvertently promoting things that make things rougher underneath the surface. So in my view, it's not really a contradiction. They're not really at odds. It's not security or human rights and democracy. And I believe very strongly that the long term, and again, you have to be able to have a long-term view. You have to be able to invest the time. But the long-term view to me is that Americans and the United States are more stable and prosperous and secure. And prosperous because you've got this economy that is stable and functional and predictable when you are dealing with more countries that are run by the rule of law, that are provide rights to their citizens, that have human rights and democracy in a functional sense, not just window dressing, because those are the types of nations that, and we can see this with Europe today, that are the reliable partners when really bad things are happening and when you need to come together with someone that you trust to make decisions, to do things that are difficult, to make difficult steps, but to do them together and to kind of have each other's backs. I don't think at the end of the day that, certainly not the Russias, but the Saudi Arabias of the world, UAE, like these are places that have our back. We've been making a lot of decisions about foreign policy in recent decades on the premise that, well, if we help fund security and help provide security and build the strong relationship with some of these strong dictators, that in the end, when we need help on something like oil prices around the world, that those are the ones who will be able to provide the support that we need. And we're finding out now that that's not necessarily true. But that's coming from a long history of us prioritizing, not just short-term security issues, but also short-term economic interests. And having that shorter-term view, we're kind of almost mortgaging our future. And if you look at this great conflict that we have now that Biden has put in terms of democracies versus autocracies, I'd agree that if you're just looking at this in moralistic terms, it can be problematic in terms of making foreign policy decisions. But if you take away that short-term lens and you say, well, if we all work together with the partners and allies that we trust, and we kind of reestablish that both the security and economic kind of imperatives that allowed us to be less reliant on partners who don't share our values, like the rule of law and equality, then maybe that will in the long run make us more secure. It's going to be less secure in the near term, because of how we've structured our economy in particular. But I think that's a lesson that we're learning now. That lack of predictability of certain partners is really coming back to bite us.
Well, it certainly is a significant moment of crisis for U.S. foreign policy and for the world, given recent events in Ukraine. Can you discuss a little bit more, perhaps, about some of the tension, perhaps, of domestic politics, and how do you see that as constraining more or less, what opportunities that might be creating, and broadly, how you see it affecting the way the United States will continue in its response to the Ukraine crisis?
I think that, the domestic situation, it's hard. It's very limiting for our kind of creativity in terms of how we respond to these issues. But one of the things I think this administration has been doing a good job of is trying really hard to explain all of the different steps it's taking and why it's not taking other steps. But let's look at a very specific issue such as the question about whether or not we're going to do a no-fly zone, right? This comes out in large part because you've got people on both sides of the aisle criticizing the government for, criticizing the administration for not doing more, right? not doing enough in Ukraine. I do wish they'd spend a little bit more time saying, here is the entire complement of everything that we're doing. We're not doing nothing. But that said, we've got this political situation where the administration is forced to have to respond to things that I don't think are always in good faith. Pushback and trying to make the government this administration look really weak. And because we have this we are victims of our own open democracy. We are there to be judged, but our administration, our government is there to be judged by the people. So I see that as both a limitation and an opportunity, though. It's a limitation because it becomes something, when you don't have easy problems to solve. Ukraine is not an easy problem to solve. It's very easy for people to be critical. And it's very easy for people to kind of throw punches that the public can latch onto and say, we're being weak. Well, what would be the consequence in this case of being strong? It would be World War III. And I think a lot of the people who've been pushing this, and pushing the ideas of escalation, probably know that. Not everyone. There is that emotional tug to want to go and defend innocent civilians being pummeled right now. But I do think that there's that risk that we have that political element in there. And I don't think that, I don't think 15 years ago that we would have been seeing so much angst around it, because we have in the past been able to rally around causes that, that America's kind of built for in a lot of ways. And whether or not we're very good at it, we certainly have the, slogans for it, for fighting for democracy around the world. So I fear, though, that as things in our domestic situation have become so incredibly just polarized and really, really quite nasty on that level, we aren't able to do what we've done in the past around big international crises and come together. I can't imagine a scenario where, look at the response after 9/11. Not only did we come together, people came together on both sides of the aisle to approve really heinous things that we then did. That was the level at which the United States and the American people came together in defense of what they thought was right. So I do feel as though the polarized nature of our domestic situation right now has made it even harder for President Biden and for anyone at that level to make the really hard calls and get the kind of support that they need from Congress. And one of the we saw this in the Obama administration and for different reasons in the Trump administration, but one of the things that it pushes, it leads a presidency to do more on its own, independent of Congress, and that makes our foreign policy a lot less stable and reliable for our partners. So I think that there's been probably the biggest hit on our foreign policy because of this domestic discord has been our relationship with allies. And you've heard it even the past few weeks with allies we're working closely with saying, well, that's great right now, but what happens in a couple of years? We don't know that the next administration will have this angle. And since it's not firmed up in law, it's very easy to reverse a lot of what we've done.
Well, the public in the United States remains very much focused on the war in Ukraine. I notice every day as the papers arrive, it's the top headline, big print, what's happening now. And of course, the administration's focus is there as well with the broad diplomatic, economic, and military response to the crisis. And of course, in the background, we have increasing tension in the Taiwan Strait, among other things. How much do you think that this situation will distract attention from circumstances like in Juba, say, where you spent an important part of your career? And what do you think the consequences might be of losing really focus on these seemingly less important places?
It is a problem, and it's a problem, getting back to what I mentioned before about the State Department, and one of our biggest issues here is that you just don't have a full complement of diplomats available to start addressing what's going on in the rest of the world. You have a war in Ethiopia that started about 20 months ago, in November of 2020, and that war is a massive threat to the region. It's a massive humanitarian crisis. I have a good Ethiopian friend whose uncle in Mekelle in the Tigray region recently died because he couldn't get insulin. When you hear Americans who are just up in arms about the fact that there are Ukrainians in cities that have been besieged for a few weeks, and I'm like, there are Ethiopians who have been besieged for well over a year. So it does distract from the ability of the administration to put some focus on these other parts of the world. But there's also an opportunity there, which is this opportunity to highlight, remember how much empathy you had for the Ukrainians? Well, let's talk about some of these other issues and why they're also very important to our position in the world. I mean, the war in Ukraine is uniquely challenging to the international world order, and it is uniquely threatening to the United States and of course, Europe. For a variety of reasons, Russia being a nuclear power, this being a state aggression against another state. Most of the conflicts that we know in the world are proxy wars, but they also are primarily within a single state. So that is very different. But I actually think the reason that most Americans are so fixated on it has a lot less to do with those big geopolitical issues and has much more to do with this is Europe, and we can relate more to them, and maybe they have trips to Europe or they have family roots in Europe. And that's one of the reasons that it's so much more, it just hits more home. So my hope is that this is an opportunity to raise that kind of awareness. But in order to be able to take this very kind of non-military approach, right? I mean, you've got all the whole toolbox of foreign policy tools at our disposal. And in this conflict, the Biden administration has really prioritized, everything short of direct military action. And that's a huge shift on a lot of what we've done in the past 20 years. So my hope is that we're going to see how effective those other tools are. They're much less expensive than direct military action. They're not likely to drag us into 20 years of war. And if we can prioritize and promote that and recognize that that's the better way to go, when it's possible, there are always times when you must use military force. But if we can prioritize that, maybe we can start prioritizing better budget for the State Department, so that they've got the personnel that they need. I mean, when I was in South Sudan, I was doing 2.5 jobs at least, and it would cost far less than one F-35 to fill another position there.
Thank you, Elizabeth. This has been a fascinating conversation, and now it's time to hear from you. Dr. Erica Kubik, the Director of Programming for the Council, has a microphone, and she can pass that to those of you in the auditorium who raise your hands. When you ask a question, please state your name and who you represent, your university, company, organization, or simply yourself. And if you're watching remotely, you have an opportunity to type your questions into the YouTube chat box, and we'll get to your query that way. And if you're online, you can also text a question to 616-308-6560.
Tillerson-Pompeo State Department and the Blinken State Department on the way they handle and look at different aspects of the State Department.
It's a very good question, and yes, I have many comments on that. But the biggest difference between, and actually all three were quite different. To start with the Pompeo State Department, at the time there was just really no appreciation for not even no appreciation. There was a lot of suspicion about the career Foreign Service officers and civil servants who were there at the State Department, and that became. I mean, it really. And that was when I was still there. No, that was after I left. Shortly after I left, and it was just a very, very high level of distrust that went in both directions. Now, what that means in reality, what that means in person, is that you just don't have the flow of information. You aren't using all of the resources that you have because you had this relatively small political appointee class of folks who were trusted. You had a lot of very highly qualified career diplomats who, if they were not trusted for whatever reason, they were relegated, I'm not even kidding you, to the basement, to different offices to read FOIA, Freedom of Information Act requests and do other inane tasks to keep them busy but out of the hair of the policymakers. And so that was that was a very difficult time for the State Department. And what it basically meant was that all of our foreign policy was reliant on what was happening in the White House and at the very top echelon of the State Department. And you just can't maintain the kind of work that we do around the globe when you're only utilizing that top threshold. You also miss out on all of the relationships that are built. I mean, you can't send someone to negotiate something with no backstory behind it, with no cultural or historical references to know who you're dealing with and what the bigger scenario is. So the Pompeo State Department was probably a very serious low. I'd say the Tillerson State Department was different from that. I do believe that Secretary Tillerson appreciated aspects of the State Department, and he claimed that he was, he initiated some activities that he claimed were to streamline things going in. I don't think that he had the best interests of the State Department at heart, but I think he came in relatively well-meaning with kind of a corporate approach, right? He had a corporate background, and I think that it just simply wasn't a good fit for what we were trying to do, for what we need to do. And it's not a business. I mean, there's not a bottom line in the State Department. You're not going to increase profits there. And so a lot of his approach, which may have been well-meaning, basically just really hurt morale as well and undercut our ability to do certain things. I mean, he didn't understand. Don't get me wrong. The State Department needs some improvements. It needs to be streamlined. Some offices probably need to be disbanded or brought into others. But if you come in and try and do that basically with an outside consulting firm that has no basis in what we're doing, needless to say, it didn't go very well. One of the best aspects of the Blinken State Department is a longstanding history and appreciation of what your foreign service officers and your civil servants do, because Blinken, he served in the State Department before. He's had different posts there. He understands how the interagency works. So he understands how the White House interacts with the State Department, how the State Department interacts with the Department of Defense, and bringing that knowledge in, they really were able to hit the ground running. Now, that said, I do think that there's still a bias in anyone on the political side towards, of course you want to hire in the people that you know and trust. And luckily, some of them were folks that he had gotten to know within the State Department who were career diplomats. But so I would say in terms of the health and well-being of the State Department as an institution and its ability to function, it is much better. But if you ask folks on the inside, I think there's a lot more kind of comfort level, but there's still hope that maybe somebody's going to start tackling some of the challenges that you have in the State Department. Challenges with hiring and promotion, the fact that you cannot hire anybody mid-level. So if you end up with these gaps that we have after a lot of attrition in the past few years, you can't grow a diplomat overnight. So how do you bring people in who have the language skills and the cultural background? And how do you build up the ranks again? How do you bring diversity into the higher ranks when it takes 20 years to kind of grow a full diplomat? So it's not perfect, but this administration went a very long way by coming in, by putting someone in at the head of the State Department who knows it, and by just saying over and over again that diplomacy is important and we appreciate what diplomats do. We've got a long way to go before we're able to address global problems all thoroughly with diplomats and diplomacy, but we're on the right track, I think.
I've got some text questions, and this I think is a good follow-up. Legislators from opposing parties can hold up ambassador appointments forever, it seems. So why is that possible, and can it be changed?
It's a problem, and yes, they can. I don't see a good political way to change it. The best way to get past it, and this is another one of the many problems that we just didn't used to have to this level, and it's another victim of a very fraught political domestic situation. But the way to make that less of a problem is to have fewer political appointments that have to be entirely turned over with every administration. One of the challenges is that if you want to hold up confirmations at this stage within the first, let's say in the first year of a new administration, you can hold up dozens and dozens of them. Now, if we're kind of spreading our appointments out of ambassadors and others over the course of several years, and it's a lot more divvied up rather than so many of them happening at once, it just becomes less susceptible to the political gamesmanship. I think that Congress really likes the wrenches that they can throw in any administration, so I don't see us getting rid of that entirely soon, but kind of reducing the number of politicized appointments would really help.
Got a couple more. President Biden gave a major global collaboration speech in Warsaw the other day, but all the focus has been on 9 words related to Putin staying in power. And our viewers asking, was this a big gaffe, an emotional response, or a wily strategy?
Well, I hate that his aides walked it back so quickly. I mean, first of all, even if it was a gaffe, you could definitely have just owned it. But I don't think it was a gaffe. I think that Biden's been around a very, very long time. He says what he feels. Occasionally, it is maybe ill-timed. But I think that what he said actually today, when he finally said he's not walking it back, he said it was a moral response, and I think that that is true. He certainly didn't say that we're changing American foreign policy, and this fixation on the fact that that one sentence was an indication that we have now moved towards regime change is, to me, really overreading it. But I also think that you can look at what role it's playing in strategy. I mean, right now, Zelensky is saying, very openly, here are very certain things that I would gladly negotiate on, specifically with Russia. So, Zelensky's over here with the sticks, and with the carrots, and perhaps you need somebody with the sticks just to remind Putin that there are people out there who are very disappointed in it, and they do also have nuclear weapons. But I don't think that it was a gaffe. I think that he said what he intended to. I just think that that Biden has been around for a much longer time, so he has a bigger tolerance for speaking truth than a lot of people in politics.
How should the Biden administration address the humanitarian crisis in Venezuela? How could Russia's invasion affect Maduro's support from Putin?
Well, I actually think that the move that we saw just a few weeks ago with the State Department first sending out, the first lines of communication with that regime that we've seen in a really long time was quite well timed and made a lot of sense. And many people are saying, well, isn't this just trying to capitulate to another dictator for short-term interests? But if you paid attention to what those discussions were about, they were about, well, there are certain things that we can do if you're able to start providing and filling in some gaps with the oil, but also if you tack on to that, reopening your conversations with the opposition and start, building in some transitional movements there. So I think it was a window. I mean, whenever we do big sanctions on a country, we often don't have an exit strategy, and that can be very dangerous. So this might have suddenly opened a window where, Maduro's regime is under a lot of pressure with the sanctions that we've had on for a few years there now, and might well be looking for an opportunity for an out, and that might give us the leverage we need to get, to get a couple of benefits at the same time. Well, it remains to be seen. I don't think that Russia has a whole lot to offer the Maduro regime right now, so I'm not that concerned about that element. In terms of the humanitarian situation, which is very dire there as well, lifting sanctions would go a very long way to do that. So if we can find a way to be able to roll that back while getting some progress towards a move in the direction of democracy. It's not going to be an overnight fix, but again, these are long-term, almost generational changes that you have to work on. So I always thought that the moves that we saw during the Trump administration on that were particularly short-sighted. And if you don't have anything to offer to say, well, if you change this, then we'll get rid of the sanctions, then the sanctions just become a punishment on the people of the country for no reason.
Hi, my name is Steve Redman. I'm representing myself. Quick question though, as a diplomat who worked in Africa, the Chinese have certainly made an attempt to have influence in Africa economically, and they seem to be doing it with rather large investments in infrastructure projects and such. That seems like a good way to get influence. How do we combat that and get more involved in Africa and some of the markets that are out there and some of the resources that we certainly could use in our economy?
And we have been really involved on the continent in a number of ways over a period of time, but you're correct. It's a very different approach than what we've seen with China. And China's has been much more, people claim it's no strings attached, but nothing's no strings attached, right? Like China's doing it for its political influence. China's doing it for votes in the UN General Assembly. You might think that doesn't sound very important, but the number of times that I've had to go out and take an important diplomatic letter to go talk to my counterpart in South Sudan or Somalia about wanting them to vote a certain way. China's doing that as well. So it comes into kind of the sheer level of of volume of influence and how you get that. But my position has always been, pardon, we're not going to out-China China. Frankly, we can't build things as cheaply as they do anyway. We're out of practice. Look at our own infrastructure. We're not going to go in there and build big infrastructure projects. But, pardon, but what we do We do a lot of assistance on healthcare. You'd think we'd do more of that at home too. But we do a lot of work on the healthcare systems. We do a lot of work on agriculture. I mean, USAID has projects all over the continent. And we do have different economic ties and economic relationships that we built through things like AGOA, different trade agreements. So we're working on those areas. But what we're not doing is something that's that easy. You build it and you see it and you're like, look at this stadium, look at this bridge. So it requires more of a sales job. And what we need to get better at doing is selling what we're doing. But I would say the biggest influence that the United States has in Africa, and I did a podcast interview last year with a former Minister of Public Works of Liberia, and we were discussing this issue. And he was like, China builds these big things, and the more democratic governments there, actually, they need that, because then they can say, hey, look what I brought to this country, look at what I built, because they need to get elected. But he said the thing that I never hear, students, China started bringing more students to China. We've actually made it harder for students to come to our country, and that's a huge way to influence people, is by having them come and engage and get an affinity for our country and what our values are and what we can do in practice in our communities. But what we should be doing is building out more on that. But even so, it's our soft power, it's our reputation, which we need to work to preserve, our reputation as a free and democratic country. But he was telling me, students who come back from America are always like, the cities are beautiful, and the plays that I went to, and the culture in these places, the music, and people who come back from, students who come back from studying in China are like, they were very, very big buildings. Those buildings were huge. They don't come back with any kind of cultural affinity they've built up. And I think that it's those things that are intangible that we need to recognize and capitalize on more. We need to push those things out there and recognize that having people come study and do fellowships and exchanges is really where we build that strength. And a lot of the people who go through Fulbright programs and things like that end up in leadership positions in government, and that's very helpful for us. So I think we're not going to out China, but we need to go with our strong suits, and we need to spend more of our time promoting those things and possibly take more of that away from our efforts to boost up our military all the time and use these cheaper ways to gain influence and support.
How does this administration prioritize where to focus its limited diplomatic resources? So example, Russia, Ukraine, China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Middle East and Africa, et cetera, et cetera. Does the U.S. have a long-term strategic foreign policy vision?
Oh, I wish. The Pentagon comes out with their with their big strategy document, like every year, and we don't have anything. We have documents in the State Department. We kind of like embassies come up with their plans, but the short answer to it is much of it is reactive. There are people and there are offices where they strategize on what we should focus on, and they decide where to shift resources, but we don't even have the resources to put much effort into figuring out where to put our resources in the State Department. The Department of Defense has tremendous numbers of people whose entire jobs is like reworking the annual strategies and that type of thing. So the real answer is necessity. It's kind of necessity and inertia, really, like both of those. So Ukraine, it's necessity. It's the fact that this has come up. It is threatening the very world order that we live in. It is threatening our NATO allies, who we have, treaty obligations to defend. There is no turning away from Ukraine. But if you look at a lot of other issues and kind of where we have heavier footprints and where we're more engaged, a lot of that becomes more about inertia. The Middle East right now, those embassies are pretty well staffed, and they have been because over the past few decades we've been very focused on our military interest and financial interest in the Middle East. Africa, meanwhile, we've been saying for many years that this is a massive continent of many countries, and its population is tremendous when you compare it to other parts of the world. It's also the heart of where climate change is having the biggest impact in the world. So there are really urgent national security reasons for us to be focused on Africa. But we do have limited capacity, and many of those embassies are still understaffed because it just hasn't been a priority. You actually have a lot of very well-staffed embassies and small consulates in European countries that frankly could do with far less than they have. You're not going to make that argument right now with the war in Ukraine, by the way. But let's say a couple of years ago, you certainly would have. But the problem is, that's where the billets are. That's where the seats are for the embassy. That's where we've been focused for so long, because Europe was the kind of center of our foreign policy for a long time. So the State Department doesn't really shift that quickly or that well. Now, that said, I will say China has been a focus. We've had increasing numbers of foreign service officers learning the language and preparing to go over there for long-term investment of time in their careers. So we do see some of that. But no, I don't think we're particularly strategic.
Hi, my name is Polly Diven, and I teach at Grand Valley State University. Some of these lovely students are mine. You've bemoaned several times now the fact that the State Department doesn't have the resources and that the Defense Department does. To what extent do you believe that that is because there is a natural clientele for the Defense Department, which are all the military industrial contractors? I mean, $37 billion this year to the top four. 500,000 jobs here and there that are related to the defense factors. I mean, the State Department doesn't have its, go spend money group like the military-industrial complex is. Do you think that's an explanation, or do you think there's something else going on?
Oh, I think that's a massive part of it, absolutely. I mean, I think there are a few things going on, but money always is a very big part of these issues. It's about a constituency. The State Department does not have a constituency in Congress. The Department of Defense has the constituencies not only of all of the military-industrial complex, all of the money that they spend on politicians, which is absolutely massive. But you also have the military, and you have every town and state that has a base, and those bases are a lot of jobs and they're a lot of money. So much of what we do with our military is not about national security, and that's one of the worst things. I mean, I'm not going to tell you what I think the right number is for the military's budget. I don't think it's what we're looking at right now. But what's more important is just to reassess, based on our national security needs, what we should be spending it on, instead of having it driven by contracts. I mean, the number of things that we are buying up that the Pentagon doesn't even want is really quite embarrassing. Some of that is because there's this deep belief in the Pentagon that in order to save money, we want to make sure that we keep competition. So we don't want to have only one company making missiles. So we're going to find a way to contract another company to make missiles. And then we will save money on the missiles. It doesn't really add up. It's not a market-driven universe. But I'd say there are a couple of other issues with it too. One, which I always like to talk about, is that the Pentagon has a liaison office in Hollywood. So does the CIA. They do serious work promoting the Department of Defense. I mean, if you see any military hardware in a movie, the Pentagon has directly consulted on it and probably loaned them that aircraft carrier at no cost, just for the rights of getting to read the script and make sure that it doesn't say anything untoward towards our military. So, I mean, this isn't natural. It's driven by their strategy to do so, and so you have this very high respect for the U.S. military and almost no understanding of what diplomacy even is. So I think part of it is on state. They haven't promoted themselves. There's an old law, the Smith-Mundt Act, that prohibits domestic propaganda, and that's been changed many times over. But that history goes, and you still see it today. Anytime you want to do a talk somewhere in the United States about diplomacy when you're on the inside, there's always that concern that you might break the law by propaganding to Americans. So I think a big part of that too is that the State Department needs to make its own case a lot better than it does. But yeah, I'd say the biggest reason is probably money.
This is great, and we've got some questions coming in. So I'm going to read a couple and have you respond. When we think about the U.S., you briefly mentioned this, humanitarian relief, especially thinking about the USAID. Why don't we use that agency more in COVID relief and other support to build coalitions? And then a second question, does the United States or United Nations still matter? So maybe you could ask or answer those questions.
I would say, I mean, both organizations do a lot and do matter. USAID has been at the forefront of a lot of what we've been doing on COVID around the world. I mean, it's a resource limitation. I think that, USAID is out there and trying to work with our vaccine diplomacy in particular, but also trying to find ways to help overcome some of the vaccine hesitancy that you have in places, particularly where governments aren't really trusted. So USAID is out there. But, I mean, much of what we've done on COVID overseas has been kind of a political issue anyway as well. The question is, how many vaccines are we providing? Are we providing the ones that are needed? Are we providing things that aren't close to expiration dates and that type of thing? But USAID, I mean, the scale of the problem that we saw with COVID and what we needed to do really dwarfed the size of what USAID is able to execute overseas. But I think that they did do a lot. They've been out there. They've been trying to make sure that people know it's coming from the U.S. government, the assistance that we are able to do. Because again, it's important. You talk to folks at USAID and there's this belief that they're only doing, humanitarian and development work and that it's not a foreign policy tool, but it's absolutely a foreign policy tool, as it should be. It's not just about getting credit, but the question is, building a place where we've got, where we have that kind of influence, where that can, come back and help us when we need other countries to come to our aid in different scenarios, which in this very globalized world does happen. What extent is USAID involved in, kind of the soft power aspect of the diplomacy around that? You really do see a lot of that. And having Samantha Power at the helm of USAID is actually, it's huge because she is globally known. And I think that appointment really indicated that, the Biden administration wanted to make sure that it was clear that our development work, our humanitarian work really is a key part of our engagement with the world. So I think that that's been a really good move. Why we've been able to do not as much as we probably should have, certainly early on, that got back to that domestic foreign policy tension. And I think at a time when we weren't able to address things at home as well as we could, we were behind the curve on COVID response. And I do think that that harmed our reputation for a little while, and that gets back to, that's not USAID's fault. USAID was ready to do the needful, but you have to have that political support and able to do so. Switching over to the United Nations, I mean, it is a massive bureaucracy with many, many flaws, but it does still matter. It is the place where all countries come together and have a say, and grievances are aired and votes are taken, and it is largely in many ways a messaging a messaging platform. It is also a peacekeeping platform. I mean, it's an organization that is deeply involved and has big missions in a lot of countries around the world. But it has a design flaw. And we look at the scenario right now, and some people might say, well, it's great to have an institution where everyone can come together. You got to see things like a big vote where every country in the world got an opportunity to say where they stood on the invasion in Ukraine. And I think that was pretty telling, and it was helpful for the U.S. government to look around and see how many friends that they had who didn't vote for it. Those are really kind of telling moments. It's a place where you can literally see, the votes between China and the United States added up and see who's got the bigger corner of the world. In terms of an institution that can really accomplish a lot of goals, I think that's difficult. But you go back just a few years though. Even I want to say it was maybe 2017 was the last time that we had a vote where something that was really some just very atrocious behavior in terms of our international world order. You had the coup in, I want to say it was Burkina Faso. I'm looking at Emma so she can tell me if I'm right. One of the coups in West Africa a few years ago, I believe it was Burkina, got condemnation by basically a letter of condemnation from the UN Security Council. China and Russia both agreed. That doesn't happen anymore, and it won't happen, and we're not going to see it happen for a long time. But for a number of years, the UN was a place where you could actually get that kind of consensus. Is it less useful now because there is nothing that we can get full consensus on? Probably, but I think it still has a role to play, and I think we just always need to understand what the limitations are. I mean, having a certain number of countries with a veto on any major action it's a limitation you can't get around.
We are running out of time, but I'm going to ask one last question. and then we'll wrap up. The State Department has strong influence in countries like Haiti, yet its role supporting Haitian leadership seems disastrous. What are we getting wrong, and what should we be doing?
You're getting a lot wrong in countries like Haiti, but it's also, you have to understand that there was a long period of time where we kind of thought that we could fix everything. And I think that there's been this humbling of the United States in recent years as we've lost a couple of wars, and we're recognizing, rightfully so, that there are problems and challenges that we can't necessarily fix. You had, with this latest issue in Haiti with the assassination of the president, there was a whole slew of people in Washington who wanted us to send in military troops, which is just this awful knee-jerk reaction that has proven very, very bad to our outcomes in the very recent past and in many situations. But it still becomes this thing, this bell that we ring to say, this is very serious. We must do something, so we must send troops in. That's one of the things that went wrong with Haiti. But Haiti has a very long history, a very long and unjust history of how the outside world has treated it since it's been independent. So you have entrenched, ingrained issues there. How could we do better? I mean, the U.S. can't fix Haiti. What we need to do is stop trying to pick winners in Haiti and start trying to... I think one of the biggest problems with our foreign policy is that we miss occasions when it is better to do less than more. Because we have this tendency to inadvertently do bad things, inadvertently prop up bad actors in the name of stability, inadvertently prop up what we call democracy by trying to keep and force people who have been elected in unfair elections. It's a habit that we've built up, which comes from a tendency to kind of trust the government in charge more than others, to really want to sign off on elections as being a shining moment for democracy, regardless of how flawed they might be. And so I think one of our biggest challenges with Haiti has been this idea that we thought that we could, shift entire kind of patterns with just a little use of our military force, and that has proven wrong. So my suggestion on Haiti for the American approach is to kind of rein back our expectations and really aim on doing less harm rather than trying to do all the good in the world. And I think if we accept the limitations of what we can do sometime, it's probably the best that we can do in some of these situations.